Welcome, scholars, to this final review of the Q2 rhetorical analysis question. To begin with, let's just go over the task. You're asked to analyze the rhetoric of a given passage, and the passage can really come from anything written since the 16th century. Really, the only thing you know to expect is that the passage is going to be inherently persuasive. So you got to just be ready for everything. And if you've learned the method that I've preached over and over this year, and we've practiced so many times, really you can tackle any passage that you see. When responding to the task, just a note about what effective responses look like. Effective responses will understand and acknowledge the precise purpose of the text, including the subtleties that a cursory reading may miss. An effective response will also accurately identify those key strategies that the speaker employs in order to accomplish whatever specific rhetorical goals he or she may have. Effective responses will also examine the rhetorical situation and analyze all strategies as responses to that situation. And finally, effective responses will thoroughly explain what the speaker does and why the speaker does it. Ineffective responses, on the other hand, will, among other things, misunderstand the purpose of the text or ignore certain nuances of the purpose. Ineffective responses may misidentify strategies, or instead focus on strategies which are merely incidental to and not key to the speaker's rhetorical goals. Ineffective responses may misinterpret or ignore the rhetorical situation altogether. And finally, ineffective responses will often explain what the speaker says and perhaps vaguely indicate why, but these responses generally are more concerned just with paraphrasing or summarizing what the speaker says. Some things to avoid on the Q2, and these are just based on some observations I've had of the last few Q2s you've written in class. First of all, don't relate every strategy back to the same central purpose. Yes, the speaker does have a central overarching purpose, and all strategies are designed to ultimately help him or her achieve that purpose, but when you explain why a speaker uses a particular strategy, explain its particular effects, those effects that are unique to that particular strategy. If you make sure that you chunk the passage down, as we've talked about in class, and make sure that you identify the purposes, the individual or smaller purposes of each chunk, that will help you avoid doing this, because each strategy you find in each chunk is going to refer back to a smaller purpose, and those smaller purposes are all going to contribute to accomplishing the central or overarching purpose. Next, don't write about how the audience reacts. You don't know how the audience reacts. You can only analyze what you believe the speaker is trying to do, how you believe the speaker is trying to make the audience react. So avoid writing about how, quote, this comparison makes the audience feel ashamed. You don't know that this comparison actually makes the audience feel ashamed. Instead, write about how this comparison is designed to make the audience feel ashamed. Yeah, it's a wordier version, but it's saying something that's far more provable than the alternative. Next, beware of summary disguised as analysis. This is something I've seen creep up in the last couple of months. Make sure that you're always focusing on writing about what the speaker does, not about what the speaker says. When you write about what the speaker says, you're just summarizing the passage, and this is usually something that students who score down in the 2 and the 3 range do a lot of, and it's because summarizing a passage is way easier than rhetorically analyzing it, and so a lot of students just want to put something on the page and they take the easy way out, and it's always going to get you a lower score. But when you refuse to just talk about what the speaker says and instead focus on what the speaker does, that's where you actually cross the boundary into analysis. Think back to those 3 means of persuasion that we studied, and think about how the speaker is utilizing one or more of these means. If you process everything that you write about through one or more of those 3 means of persuasion, then you're discussing what the speaker is doing and not just what the speaker is saying. Because this is such a big problem, I wanted to give a quick example of what I mean by summary disguised as analysis. That is, a student who thinks they're talking about what the speaker is doing, but really just summarizing what the speaker is saying. I've gotten rhetorical analysis that looks a little like this recently. The speaker argues that people in debtors' prisons are robbed of their most productive years, in order to make his audience realize how unfortunate it is that these men have their most valuable years taken away from them. Now, the student who writes this is identifying something the speaker is doing. He's some argument that the speaker makes. But when they're explaining why the speaker is doing what they're doing, they're basically just repeating that the speaker is doing that thing. If you look at this again, the speaker argues that people in debtors' prisons are robbed of their most productive years in order to make his audience realize how unfortunate it is that this is happening. So the student here is basically saying the speaker argues this so that his audience will know this. That's not really doing anything but summarizing the argument. Here's what an actual analysis might look like. The speaker argues that people in debtors' prisons are robbed of their most productive years in order to make his case that, in addition to being inhumane, jailing people for debts is economically harmful, which adds some practical reasoning to his previous moral reasoning. Now, in this example, I'm not just restating restating what the author is saying. I'm actually analyzing what it's helping him do. It's adding another dimension of reasoning to his overall rhetorical goals. So that is what I mean by summary disguised as analysis. Be very careful that you're not slipping into that mode. Continuing with things to avoid. When you identify a specific device that a speaker uses, make sure you supply evidence which clearly indicates that that device is being used. If you say the speaker uses an enthymeme, make sure you break down the premise and conclusion that the speaker supplies, because an enthymeme is a two-part statement made of a premise and a conclusion. Do not forget to actually identify what the enthymeme is. If you say that the speaker cites examples of something, make sure you say what those examples are, but also the generalizations the speaker is trying to support through those examples, because that's what examples do. Exemplification is designed to support a generalization, and that generalization is usually designed to support some larger argument. If, for instance, this is very recent on my mind from reading the Swift analyses, if you say that the speaker uses imagery, make sure you identify the images, the kinds of images, and the sensations, emotions, ideas communicated through those images. It's not enough just to say the speaker uses images of women and children begging for food. You need to identify what those images actually are. Women and children begging for food, in addition to their kinds, those are visual images, but also communicate olfactory and auditory images as well. And then the sensations, emotions, and ideas communicated through those images. Those images are designed to or communicate feelings of sorrow and downtrodden life and foul smells and that sort of thing. We want to dig very deeply into the devices that you identify to make sure that you understand what that device is actually used for. Also, don't overstate a rhetorical obstacle or flat out invent one that doesn't exist. Don't just assume, for instance, that the audience is against what the speaker wants every time in every passage. Don't assume the audience is entirely ignorant of or unfeeling toward what the speaker is talking about either. I noticed this in the Chavez analysis. A lot of students who, because they're just used to a hostile audience, I guess, just wrote that the audience was against Chavez's farm workers movement. Well, that's not true at all, because this was he was writing to a religious magazine that was devoted to helping people in need. Okay, so it's not going to be an openly hostile audience at all. It's going to be an audience that's partially receptive. And similarly, it's wrong to assume the audience is ignorant of the speaker. Just because you don't know who the speaker is doesn't mean that people don't know who the speaker is. Cesar Chavez in this would have been the 1970s. A lot of people would have known who Cesar Chavez was. He was kind of an important political figure in the United States at that time, especially in regions where there were a lot of agriculture and that sort of thing. So don't just assume those things. Make sure you think carefully about the rhetorical situation before jumping to any conclusions. Also, don't forget that rhetorical leverage does exist. In this last, the Chavez essay that I was just referring to, he actually has a lot of rhetorical leverage that he relies on. Yet, very few students actually talked about that rhetorical leverage. Instead, they invented or overstated rhetorical obstacles. Some keys to success now, things you should try to do on the Q2. First of all, don't forget to supply text evidence for everything you claim that a speaker does. When the exact wording is important, use direct quotation. When it isn't important, make sure you paraphrase. Either way, though, you must cite line numbers, and this is actually a really good trick for making sure that you're always supplying text evidence. If you force yourself to supply line numbers for everything you claim you see in a passage, then you're always forcing yourself to use text evidence. Also, consider using the rhetorical figures that we've learned in our daily rhetorical figures as your terminology in the essay. You don't have to know the name of everything you see a speaker do, and not everything even has a name. But these terms, the daily rhetorical figures we've learned throughout the year, they are the language of rhetoric. They're the language that you share with your essay grader. Using these terms can also help you avoid slipping into summary mode. For instance, if you force yourself to identify an argument not just as the speaker argues, but if you force yourself to identify, ooh, that's a refutation, okay, which refutation is a device. It doesn't have a fancy Greek name, but that's okay. That will help you make sure that you're not slipping into summary, but you're focusing on analysis. Other really common devices like characterizing or characterization, defining something. Those are devices that we talked about early on in the year, and we don't want to forget those really simple, broad, argumentative devices. Also, make sure you consider situation with every strategy you discuss. It's not enough to explain that the speaker evokes anger in the audience. You must also explain why anger is necessary given this particular situation to achieve the speaker's rhetorical goals. Remember, all strategies are designed to overcome some rhetorical obstacle, and rhetorical obstacles come from rhetorical situation. When you're stuck, if you're ever stuck, I don't know what any of the rhetoric is in this passage, my brain is dead, get back to the basics. Take a deep breath, get back to the basics. Tie everything the speaker does to one or more of those three means of persuasion. Start looking for strategies which help the speaker build credibility. Look for strategies which help alter the audience's emotional disposition. Look for strategies which help make the message well-reasoned and convincing. Okay. Let's go through those three means of persuasion because it's been a while since we studied them back in October. When you're discussing an ethos strategy, that is a strategy designed to build the speaker's credibility, you want to focus on how the speaker is trying to make him or herself appear, the persona he or she is trying to cultivate before the audience, the mask he or she is wearing, if you will. Remember, audiences want to believe speakers who are intelligent, virtuous, and goodwill. That comes from Aristotle. And so we're primarily looking for those three attributes in the speaker's persona and how he or she is trying to make him or herself look that way. But also keep in mind, audiences also want to believe people who are just well qualified or people who are in authority over them. Audiences also want to believe people who think the same way and want what they want and believe in what they believe in. Generally, audience just like people who are the same as them. Okay, so all of these are different ways that a speaker can cultivate a persona that is most credible to a particular audience in a given situation. When you're discussing pathos strategies, you want to focus on how the speaker is trying to arouse specific emotions in his audience. You want to make sure that you talk about how those emotions are triggered, but also toward whom or toward what these emotions are directed. You can't forget that last part. Don't merely state that the speaker is trying to evoke fear and shame in the audience. That's too general. That's not specific enough. State that the speaker is trying to inspire the fear of a Chinese global economic takeover in his audience and evoke their shame in having done little in the past to prevent this. You want to be very specific at what is triggering that fear and what that's a fear of and who's supposed to be experiencing that fear precisely. Finally, when discussing logo strategies, this tends to be the most difficult for you guys. This is the easiest to just slip into summary because logos is, after all, just a text argument, but there are ways to discuss it in terms in purposeful terms, in terms of addressing a situation. When you're discussing logo strategies, focus on how the author builds an argument and also why he builds it the way he builds it. It's not enough to recognize an enthymeme. You have to explain why the enthymeme is necessary at that particular point in the text. Is it refuting some widely held belief? Is the enthymeme adding yet another line of reasoning to the overall case being made? Is the enthymeme forcing the audience to acknowledge some basic premise so that the speaker can make some larger argument in the conclusion? That pushes it from merely saying, "Ooh, I found an enthymeme," to talking about what it's doing. Always ask yourself, why is this method of reasoning necessary given the rhetorical situation, given who the audience is in the context, and given where it appears in the text? Okay, because remember, the order of ideas does matter, and oftentimes if you just ask yourself, why does it appear here at the beginning or in the middle, at the end? Why does this line of reasoning appear here? That can help you explain more about what it's doing rather than just repeating what it's saying. Finally, this is the best advice I can give you on the Q2. Be specific. Be precise. Be specific in your wording. Be exhaustive in your explanation. This is analysis after all. It's supposed to be really, really in-depth, really specific and exhaustive. Don't let yourself off the hook using vague or general language. If you're using vague or general language, then that tells me you only have a vague or general understanding of the text. So make sure that you're not putting pen to paper until you fully understand these strategies that you're exploring. You always one specific thing that can help you be more specific is avoid using demonstrative pronouns, which are this, that, those, and these. Avoid using those 4 demonstrative pronouns as substantives, as actual pronouns in sentences. That gives us our classic example of bad analysis, "this shows that," which is so vague. But if you just force yourself to use demonstrative pronouns as determiners, if you force yourself to say this what, this thing, this comparison, this analogy, this refutation, this concession, this argument even, if you force yourself to use demonstratives that way, then you're going to make yourself be more specific. All right, that is the end of this Q2 review. Good luck on the exam, and I'll see you in class when it's all over.